Thank you very much, Francois, and it's really a pleasure to be here in Paris. Yesterday I got the news it was going to snow and the plane wasn't going to, but everything is fine, and we're all here. It's also a pleasure to be with Pierre and with Mr. Reisen, Helmut was the first name, and of course with Thomas from UNDP. And I particularly must say that I really feel that this initiative of UNDP in the European Union is an excellent one, having been for 4 years really at UNDP. I really love that organization. There's a saying in UNDP, once at UNDP, always at UNDP, and it's true because there are a bunch of people strongly committed to development and to grassroots work in development. And I hope that despite the, as you said, despite the economic crisis, the commitment to development will not weaken. And I'm very happy to be at the Paris School of Economics. François told me a little bit what kind of architecture it is, and he reminded me and us that we had worked on general equilibrium models, and of course they have evolved through time. But the other day I went to a seminar at the IMF, and I was really both pleased and somewhat surprised that somebody was talking of a general equilibrium model that explained the subprime mortgage crisis in the US by the excessive concentration taking place in the US income distribution. So our general equilibrium models are still alive, although they have changed their nature and they're much more sophisticated now. What I would like to do today, what I was planning to do, was to take a look at the world economy, really, and because you cannot really separate the whole issue of development from the world economy, and share with you my perspective on recent developments and the implications that has on poverty reduction and the whole development paradigm, if you like. I think we are going to live in a very different world. The young people will live. Some of us will hang on. But the world is changing at an incredible pace. And I think looking at development from the perspective of the 20th century is going to be more and more difficult. Of course, there are lots of lessons to be cherished, but I think one has to understand the dynamics of today's economy, world economy, to really also be effective on development. So, Thomas, that's the kind of angle I'm going to take today. Not really focus on development per se, but on the world economy and the implications of the trends in the world economy for economic development and development economics. And Veronique is going to help me with the slides. So can we? There's this famous Nobel Prize lecture by Arthur Lewis saying that for the past 100 years the rate of growth of output in the developing world has depended on the rate of growth of output in the developed world. Development was kind of, growth was, the dynamic went from the advanced countries growing and demanding raw materials, commodities from the developing world. And so when growth in the advanced countries was rapid, then growth in the developing countries picked up. When it slowed down, the opposite was the case. And he asked us, it was almost 30 years ago now, is this linkage inevitable? The second slide is a more recent one by a very famous growth theorist, Professor Elhanan Helpman, who wrote a very nice little book in 2004 called The Mystery of Economic Growth. And he was looking to the 3 decades leading to the turn of the century. And you know how it is with writing books and getting published. My guess is, although I haven't asked him, my guess is although the book was published in 2004, he probably wrote it in 2001, 2002, and so on, looking at data that ended pretty much with the Asian crisis. So he wasn't looking at data, of 2004 or 2002. And there he says, although the differences in income per capita among rich countries have declined in the post-World War II period, the disparity between rich and poor countries has widened. At the same time, the number of middle-income countries has dwindled. We now have two polarized economic clubs, one rich, the other poor. And, you know, when we look at this sentence now, today, it seems strange. It seems this is not quite right. So I'm going to address really that whole question of divergence and convergence. And in growth theory, those of you who are more economic theory types and economic history types know that there has been a very active debate and analysis of what leads to convergence of income and what leads to divergence of income. And the third quote I wanted to show you is from Angel Gurria, the Secretary General of the OECD, although I have the feeling it's really from Helmut Reisen, but I don't know who exactly wrote it. But the heads of organization sometimes, you know, are of course the heads of organization. I was one, but very often the things that were on the cover of the UNDP publications, really my colleagues who produced them. But there's a very nice OECD report that came out in the spring, or in June, I think, right? And, you know, here it refers to a different world. I mean, that report already documents quite a different world. And it kind of turns things a little bit on its head. As you can see here, it says this report shows that the rise of the rest meaning the developing countries, is not a threat to the West. Overall, it is good news for the global economy. So I think, you know, when we look at the whole world economy in 2010, we see a very different picture from either Arthur Lewis or Professor Helpman. We see, of course, a very rapid rise of some, at least some developing countries, not necessarily all developing countries, but quite many of them. So things seem to have changed quite significantly. The next slide is one that actually François and his colleague produced in one of their publications, which is also related to this whole convergence divergence issue, which shows the decomposition of inequality, you know, using the Tile index, having one portion of if you think of one portion of inequality among world citizens being caused by differences in average income per country, and the other one being caused by inequality within countries, you see that the kind of rise of inequality that Professor Helpman was referring to, the Industrial Revolution, and those of you who have looked at the Angus Madison figures and so on, of course, know this. I mean, there was a tremendous rise of inequality due to inequalities between countries, but then the share that's due to the change of per capita incomes between of different countries kind of started to stabilize in the post-war period. And the next graph updates a little bit this story by showing the GDP per capita distribution at purchasing power parity in 1980 and in 2010. And you can see when you look at 1980, you have, you know, lots and lots of very poor countries, not that much in the middle, and some very rich countries. And when you look at 2010, you see that the distribution is much, you know, is still skewed, but is much thicker in the middle. And you have exactly what actually Professor Helpman said wasn't the case, namely you do have really the emerging of a middle, of important middle-income countries that have been growing very fast over the last 2 or 3 decades. So things have changed, and there seems to be what growth theorists call much more convergence in the world economy today than in the past, where it was really more a story of divergence. Now, when you look at the various growth theory texts, and of course some of these theories are very complicated and there are all kinds of details, so I don't want to give you the impression that I'm summarizing the whole of the, you know, of growth theory and of the convergence and divergence debate. But I think 2 dimensions are worth underlining. The first is that the Solow model, kind of neoclassical growth model, with diminishing returns to capital accumulation, predicted convergence. And one of the big puzzles for economic for growth theorists was always to say, okay, if this model predicts convergence, why don't we see it in practice? As countries accumulate more capital per worker, there are diminishing returns to that capital, so the growth rate of the more capital-intensive countries will fall over time, and the growth rate of countries that are still at the beginning of that process would be more rapid than the mature advanced economies. Now, this is, of course, if they use the same technology. And if you augment this analysis with exogenous technical progress, then, of course, you can get all kinds of results, because depending on how rapid technical progress is, you will get either convergence or divergence. If technical progress is much more rapid in the developing countries, you will get convergence. On the contrary, in the advanced economies, you get more rapid technical progress, and that can more than compensate for the diminishing returns to capital, and you could get divergence. And so, when theorists, including Professor Helpman, looked into this, they had the feeling that when analyzing technical progress, the forces of divergence were actually somewhat stronger, in the sense that countries that specialized in sectors that generated more rapid technical progress and learning had an advantage over countries for which globalization and specialization led to specialization in sectors where the actual technical progress was inherently less. Okay? So while it could have gone either way, when you read The Mystery of Economic Growth book, which is an excellent book, and I'm kind of saying he was wrong, but the whole book is very worth reading for those of you who haven't, and revisiting, because it gives an excellent and fairly non-technical summary of growth theory. But the key point he makes in explaining divergence is that specialization and international trade actually have led, over many decades, to some countries specializing in activities which are more intensive in learning by doing and generate faster technical progress, and that actually more than compensates for the diminishing returns to capital. So something has happened which seems to have changed that in the more recent past, and actually changed it really quite dramatically. And so I'm going to share with you just some of the statistics, some of the facts, when we look at the period. Now, Veronique, it's going to get a little more complicated, because I'd like you to go, well, first I'd like you to go to the ninth slide, the UNDP slide, I call it, number 9. Okay, great. Fantastic. What I want to, before I go on, I want to kind of say maybe a kind of mea culpa or something like that, because, a lot of the discussion tonight, a lot of the lecture will have to do with GDP growth rate, per capita growth rates, taken from the World Economic Outlook and the IMF database and so on. And of course, I am very aware that development is not just about GDP growth, and that there are many other dimensions that one has to keep in mind, and that in particular human development, the way UNDP defines human development, is a much larger concept. So this comes from the presentation of UNDP's current, just released Human Development Report, and shows that while of course income is important, there are significant differences between the non-income components of HDI and the income components of the Human Development Index. So, if you correlate income growth and the overall HDI change, you get the picture on the left. But if you actually correlate income growth with the non-income HDI changes, and those are basically health and education, okay, then the correlation is actually not strong, not very strong at all. I just wanted to show you this. It's not the core of the topic today, but I just want to put into parentheses that when we look at development and GDP, we have to be aware that that is only one important, but not all important and not comprehensive reflection of what of human empowerment or the increase in prosperity. The next graph is also, the next figure is also from the UNDP presentation. You can see the most rapid gainers in the 1970-2010 period in terms of the HDI. And China, of course, is very important, and that reflects largely its very rapid income growth. And then you have the improvements in the non-income HDI and only income. China is at the top if you just take income, but if you take the non-income, it actually doesn't figure in the first 10. And you have other countries that actually are doing quite well in the non-income HDI. This is a parenthesis. I'm not going to focus on that, but I do want, you to always remember that we have this GDP per capita measure in economics. We have this GDP measure. Macroeconomists just basically deal with it. Business cycle theorists and practitioners focus on it. Financial markets focus on it. And it is a partial view of development. It has to be corrected with a much wider analysis if you really want to think about human empowerment and human development. All right. Now, in the next figure, you have briefly the story of growth since the 1980s. Okay, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on this table because I think it really does tell a very important story. The last column, you don't quite see the 2015, but it's the projection of the IMF WEO for 2010-2015. There are, of course, projections to much further into the future. There are books and articles about the world in 2050, all kinds of projections, going much further than that. I will go only 2015. I think maybe 2020 one can have some confidence. Beyond that, I think what will happen is quite a big question mark. And I think the past story tells us that economists can be very wrong, and not just economists in general, analysts and historians also can be quite wrong in projecting the future. But I think the 2010-2015 projection may not be exactly right, but one can have quite a bit of confidence that those numbers will probably not be too far from the truth. So let's first look at the 1980s. And you see, and you have both in the first two lines aggregate GDP, and in the third and fourth line GDP per capita. So in that period, you see the advanced countries growing at 2.9% on average, and the emerging markets, and this is the emerging markets. They do not include the less developed countries. I will bring in the less developed countries later. So we're talking here about the emerging market, the group that the IMF and the World Bank call the emerging markets. Okay, they are growing faster already than the rich countries. But if you adjust for population growth, there is still divergence in the 80s. Okay, because in those years the population growth was still quite rapid in the emerging market countries. So while overall you have more rapid GDP growth, in per capita terms there is continued divergence. These are all the emerging markets, including China, Latin America, the Mediterranean countries, and so on. If you move to the next decade, but I cut it at 96 because 97, as you may remember, was the beginning of the Asian crisis, the big Asian crisis, you see the situation already changing quite significantly. And you have the emerging markets now growing in per capita terms, not just in overall GDP, but in per capita terms, almost twice as fast as the advanced countries. In that period, two things are happening, explaining the change, very broadly speaking. The weight of emerging Asia, and particularly of China, but also to some degree of India, in the total, because remember, these are aggregate and averages. So the weight of emerging Asia in the total grows quite a bit, because and I will come back to that later, emerging Asia grows more rapidly than the other emerging countries, okay? So you have a bigger weight of emerging Asia in the total emerging countries aggregate, and you have population growth significantly falling in many emerging markets, so that the difference between the total GDP and the per capita GDP is becoming smaller. Then comes the Asian crisis that for 2 years, you know, kind of affects pretty much the whole developing world, and very much also Asia, the emerging market countries in Asia, but not that much China or not that much India. And you see that during those 2 years, the advanced countries are still growing a little bit more rapidly in per capita terms, more or less the same in GDP terms. As you recall, the Asian crisis was not a global crisis; it didn't really affect the advanced countries. And then you move to the next group of figures, which is the period 1999 to 2007, which is you know, the period pre the big crisis of 2008. And there you see that pretty much the picture of the 1990-96 period is again renewed, although overall world growth is more rapid than in the 90s. It was really this incredible boom period, which you recall from before the crisis, where, you know, everybody was super optimistic, markets were booming, and so on. There was a little bit of an interruption in the US, particularly after the dot-com bubble in 2001, but it didn't have much of an impact. So you had the advanced countries growing quite rapidly, but again, in per capita terms, you had the emerging market countries growing twice as fast as the advanced countries. Okay? Then hits the 2008 crisis, and here, this crisis, of course, we all know, is a very different animal from what we've seen in the past. This has been a global crisis to some degree, but it also has been mainly an advanced country crisis. And for some advanced country, as we see these days, for some peripheral European countries, we're not yet out of the crisis zone. So very different from the Asian crisis, this 2008-2009 is a crisis of the advanced countries. And then when you look at the projections of the IMF for 2010-2015, you now see, and I mean, I'll just focus on the per capita numbers, and this is, compare that to the 1990-96 or 1999-2007 numbers. The projections now are that the emerging markets will grow more than 3 times as fast as the advanced countries in per capita terms. And this, of course, is historically completely unprecedented. There have been periods where some countries that you could call emerging grew rapidly, very rapidly, and of course the key example of that is Japan in the post-war period. But what we're seeing here is a very different phenomenon. It is not just 130 million people, which was the Japanese population, 130, 140, but it's, you know, 2.5, 3 billion people growing at these very, very rapid rates. So I think we are indeed entering a different historical period, which is very, very different from the past, where in fact, at least for the emerging markets, there is strong, very strong convergence, not divergence anymore. So something must have changed in the whole functioning of the growth process and of the emerging market economies that lead us to this situation. I don't think that it's 1 or 2 years. I don't think it's just the post-crisis rebound. I think this is much more durable. How durable? We'll get to that maybe towards the end of our discussion today. But certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, I would expect this trend to be confirmed. And it's not totally new trend, as you can see. It kind of started in the 90s, got interrupted by the Asian crisis, continued at the turn of the century until 2008, and you know, while there was some problem in 2008, 2009 overall in the world economy, it now is continuing at an accelerated rate, and if you like, the convergence is reinforced both by more rapid growth in the emerging market countries, in per capita terms, than in the past, but also by somewhat slower growth, significantly slower growth, not tremendously slower, because the 2.3 that you see for the advanced countries is the same as, in fact, in the 1990s, okay? But it's slower than the period 99-2000. So a slowdown or lack of acceleration in the advanced countries combined with an acceleration in the emerging market countries. Now, very quickly, let me, if you only can help me go back to the page number, well, 7 to the, this is fantastic. We're getting it right away. Okay. Let me just go back 2.5 years and try to relate the discussion so far to the decoupling debate. When in late 2007, early 2008, there were problems appearing already in the rich countries, when there was a slowdown, some analysts, some investment banks, some economists said, well, you know, there is decoupling. The fact that the emerging markets are growing so much more rapidly actually means that, you know, they have decoupled from the rich countries. And then when the crisis really hit with Lehman Brothers and with the big shock to the world economy, it was kind of the opposite story that took over, that nobody will escape the crisis, the world economy is globalized, the emerging market and developing countries will suffer too, and and certainly there will be a big worldwide crisis that the developing countries will also feel. So that was the recoupling, if you like. And Olivier Blanchard's sentence kind of reminds us of this. One of the striking characteristics of the financial crisis that originated in the US is how quickly and how broadly it spread to the rest of the world. When the crisis intensified, first in the US and then in Europe, in the fall of 2008, emerging market countries thought they might escape more or less unharmed. There was talk of decoupling. This was not to be. This is, by the way, published in the Brookings paper of economic activities of last year. If you look at the next page 8, well, no, sorry, forget page 8. Forget page 8. We'll come back to that. So what I want to address now is this, against this overall background of historical shift of growth dynamics to the emerging markets, I want to address this issue of that Arthur Lewis already asked in his Nobel Prize lecture. Well, with globalization and with countries through trade and financial sector, equity markets, financial flow, capital flows being so linked, should there not be an increase in interdependence? Okay, in some sense, a coupling of the business cycle. And how do we look at this against the long-term shift of weight to the emerging markets in overall growth? So a colleague of mine, and this is slide number 12, no, the one just before. Yeah. A colleague of mine at Brookings with a colleague at the IMF just brought out a book on emerging markets in the world economy, and they did a cross-group GDP growth correlation, distinguishing the period 1960-1985 from the period 86 to 2008. And they simply correlated growth rates of the advanced and emerging market economies as well as the advanced and other developing economies meaning those that are not in that emerging market category. The data are not quite the same as in the graphs I showed you before, but there's some degree of consistency. the other developing economies include some of they're not just the less developed countries, but also some of the not so rapidly growing emerging market or middle-income countries. But you can look at both types of correlations. And what they report is a significant decline. I mean, first, there is a positive, and it's a significant correlation between the growth of the advanced and the emerging market economies, as well as the other developing economies. But that correlation declines significantly in those two periods. And they chose those two particular periods. You could choose other periods, but they chose those particular periods. And it doesn't include the crisis, 2008-2009 crisis growth rate yet. And it doesn't include the projections. And so you see that the growth correlations are much less in the latter period than before. Now, which suggests that despite higher ratio of international trade to GDP, and despite strong capital flow linkages as well as financial sector linkages, the actual growth rates between the emerging market and the advanced countries, as well as even more so in the case of the other developing economies, are declining. Okay. The problem, I think, with these correlations is that they don't distinguish between the trend and the cyclical component of these two growth dynamics. So when we look at the data, and I want to go now to, they also have done some factor analysis, but I will not go too much into that. Let's go to 14 and look at the growth rate, the same growth rates that I showed you before in figures, but in graphs, but this time distinguishing emerging Asia. You have the story that you saw a while ago in figures, but in graphic form, and for this particular slide, I distinguish emerging Asia from the other emerging market economies. Okay, and therefore you see that there's quite a difference between emerging Asia and the rest. There is something that looks, you know, like some degree of correlation among all three series, but you see that emerging Asia is quite dominant already from the 1980s on. But remember, when you remember the other table I showed you, in 1980 there was no dominance of the emerging markets as a whole, and that the reason was that the share of emerging Asia was much smaller in the 1980s than it was, you know, in the last 10 years than it is now. Latin American economies, of course, had still much higher GDP, still have even now, higher GDP per capita, and were in the total group of emerging market economies a very important part. So if you know, there are other countries here, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the balance between Asia and non-Asia in the emerging markets, of course, shifts over time. Now, what I did with these annual data, and I know, you know, it's methodologically not so easy, but I used the detrending. We detrended by using the Hoscott-Preston filter, trying to distinguish between the trend and the cyclical component. So when we do that, we come to the next graph, 15, and this is therefore the trend component of the data, okay? Which, you know, you see a pretty clear picture here in the trend. You see the emerging Asia, which by the way includes India. I define emerging Asia as including India, being much higher, having a little bit of a downturn pretty much during the Asian crisis and the period immediately associated with it. But, you know, a very, very important difference in the trend between the emerging Asia growth rate and the growth rate of the advanced countries, the blue one, whereas the other emerging countries, until the turn of the century, are pretty much close to the advanced countries in terms of trend. Okay? But they seem to start decoupling at the turn of the 21st century. Not as much as emerging Asia, but to a significant degree. So I think this is a very important message and summary in terms of the facts. That you have what I would call trend decoupling that is primarily driven by emerging Asia, but with the other emerging countries also now joining, if you like, that difference at a somewhat lower rate. The next graph, 16, shows you the cyclical component of the same data, and here you have no decoupling at all. In fact, you have very strong coupling. Okay, so the story, the answer to the question, you know, is there decoupling or isn't there decoupling, is that if you look at trends, yes, there is definitely decoupling. But if you look at the cyclical movements of the business cycle, there is very strong coupling. In fact, the IMF, in their latest World Economic Outlook, and that's the next graph, 17, have drawn this figure of the correlation of advanced and emerging economy detrended output for a somewhat different period, 79 to 2009. But it's not that different. And unfortunately, 2009 has an important weight here. When you use that particular filter, the endpoints of the filter are a little bit problematic. I'm not a master of modern econometrics, but I know that there is a problem there. So one should take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. But you can see here that the cyclical component of the correlation is actually seems to be increasing, at least, in this particular story. Now, let me go to 18, which, well, 18 is not that particularly interesting. It tells you the same story, kind of the same story in terms of per capita growth. And then let's look at 19. And 19, and of course that's very important for development, introduces the yellow-brown line, which are the less developed countries, the poorest countries. Okay? And what's interesting in that is that actually, when you look at the less developed countries' real GDP growth rates, in terms of total GDP, it hasn't been such a bad story overall, and there seems to be quite a bit of correlation also. Looking at 20, we see the less developed countries doing quite well in terms of real GDP growth, even when we do the same detrending. So the story is not really that different for the less developed countries. Now, however, if you take growth per capita, which is 21, the less developed countries are doing a little bit less well, but they are not, again, they are not doing that badly when compared to the advanced countries. So the story of trend decoupling seems to hold also for the less developed countries, not just for the emerging market countries. It's not quite so strong. Now, to summarize, if you like, this part of the story, okay? There has been trend decoupling that started in the late 80s. The cyclical component of growth is not decoupling, and that, I think, is in a way, how should I put it, in a sense reassuring for economists, because the trade and financial linkages being very strong and increasing, it would be strange if you had, and let's go back to 6, Veronique. If you had cyclical decoupling, because that would somehow mean that international trade and financial markets notwithstanding, and equity markets notwithstanding, growth has completely different dynamics in the developing world than it has in the advanced world, which is not the case. So there is a lot of influence of the global business cycle on the variations of growth rates. But underneath it, there is a trend where the developing countries, in a way, have taken off in a happy way, in a very satisfactory way, for those of us who, for many decades, were waiting to see whether finally convergence would start. Now, in that story, again, I want to stress, and unfortunately, I don't have the data here in detail to project, because I thought we wouldn't have quite enough time. But what are the two big variables at play, I would say? Okay, the first, I'm going to come back to the technology story. The first big explanation is that technology actually works for convergence now, no longer for divergence. Why? I don't know. It's an interesting topic for economic historians to study. But the technology transfers that are taking place are so rapid, and the specialization cycles that are associated with it are such that there is a lot of catch-up growth. In other words, the countries that are absorbing technology, importing technology, can generate TFP growth, total factor productivity growth, that is significantly higher than the frontier countries that have to invent new technology, which is something, you know, that many economists always thought would happen, but which until the 1980s, late 1980s, one doesn't see very clearly in the data. But now one sees it quite clearly that the technological TFP growth is quite rapid, and it's quite rapid even in countries with very high, and I'm going to come to that, even in countries with very high investment rates. The second part of the story are the investment rates. Okay? Emerging Asia, average investment rate is 37% over the last 10 years, compared to 18–20% in the advanced countries, and compared to maybe 20–22% for the other emerging markets. So the reason, one of the reasons why emerging Asia is special and needs to be distinguished from the other emerging countries is the very high investment rate. So we have technology transfer that is taking place everywhere throughout the developing world, even towards the less developed countries. Okay? However, a subgroup of developing countries is actually saving and investment at extremely high rates, whereas other developing countries are not saving and investing at those very high rates. An interesting fact in this context, and I'm sorry that I don't have that particular graph, is that the less developed countries are actually investing at pretty high rates. The only problem with their investment rate is that about a third of it is financed by foreign aid. So they're having, you know, big foreign aid dependency. So in that sense, you know, it's more fragile, if you like, certainly than the Asian countries, which are investing their own savings. So many of them, on average, they have a current account surplus, and many of them have large current excesses of savings over investment. So you have two factors. You have the fact that technology transfer is taking place rapidly and on a large scale, and that at least in part of the emerging markets, it's backed up by very high savings and investment rates. There was some debate, for example, on China in that context, whether the Chinese growth rate would be able to continue to be as high as it has been. It may fall to some degree, but there are quite a few studies of rate of return on capital in China, on capital investment in China, that show that the rate of return remains quite high. Not quite as high as it was 10–15 years ago, but in the range of 20–22% rate of return on capital. And how is that possible? And despite the huge investment rate and the capital accumulation, it is possible because there is a lot of technical progress, a lot of it being, of course, transfers of foreign technology. In relation to technical progress, I should also say and Daron Acemoglu has a recent paper on that, that when we look at, you know, how rapid technological progress is likely to be, one shouldn't just look at transfers from country to country, but one should also look at transfers within a country from highly efficient firms to less efficient firms, or from certain provinces or cities or metropolitan areas to other parts of the country. And in fact, there's huge variance when you look at Chinese enterprises or Indian enterprises. You will see that there's huge efficiency variance, TFP level variances between different enterprises, which I think suggests that there are very great opportunities for continued high productivity growth in China for at least, you know, the next 10 years or so. And therefore the story that we've told of this rising middle in the developing countries is not one I think we're going to see the end of in the very short term. In the longer term, it's a different story. So I wanted to share this perspective with you, the trend, decoupling, and yet the strong correlation on the cyclical component, the fact that the trend decoupling is picking up steam, historically is becoming stronger, the fact that even the less developed countries are participating in this. Now, of course, they're still extremely poor, and one always has to remember, you know, a very poor country with $500 per capita growing at 10% adds very little to the income of its citizens in absolute terms compared to middle income or richer countries. But it's not a dismal story. I mean, growth is happening also in the less developed countries. Now, if you go into the details, you will see, of course, that those that are in conflict, those where there is civil war and things like that, are excluded from that picture. But broadly speaking, it's not just the well-known, you know, BRICS or a very well-performing emerging market, but it's a much larger number of countries that is participating in that story. The business cycle is a worldwide cycle, so when there are slowdowns in the advanced countries, one can expect that an impact on the emerging market and developing countries. But in a cyclical sense, that takes place. It does not reverse the story of trend decoupling. And the forces of catch-up growth that are basically due to technical progress and technical absorption in the developing countries, coupled with higher capital accumulation, which eventually may lead to diminishing returns, but we're still very far from the diminishing returns point. That's, I think, the kind of decade we're looking at. What happens after this decade, there are many other issues here. There's climate change. Will environmental natural resource constraint become strong enough to slow down the growth rate? They may. Again, a lot depends on technology, of course, but I think if nothing is done on climate change, that we may find a completely new constraint on growth. And at the end of the day, will the diminishing returns to these very large investment efforts in emerging Asia set in? Again, I don't think they will set in the next decade, 5 or 10 years, but they may well set in later on. That will take us to a very different world from the world of the development aid paradigm that, you know, many people are used to and has dominated the 1980s and 1990s. It will mean that the rich countries are not necessarily getting poorer, okay, but they will grow at best slowly. Hopefully the crisis, macroeconomic crisis, will be overcome. And yet, psychologically, it will be hard because they will see all these other countries growing in per capita terms 3 times as fast. So that will be a reality that, you know, development cooperation and the whole management of the world system will have to deal with. The second important point here is that while the emerging market and developing countries will be growing quite fast, their average per capita income levels, of course, will still be way below the Swedish, French, Japanese, or American per capita income levels. So you will have a Chinese economy very soon that is of the size of the US economy, will be equal to the US, or maybe larger at some point. But at the same time, China will still be, compared to the US, quite a poor country. and of course India even more so. Now, in a way, you've never had that in economic history. When the British Empire was the largest economy in the world, you know, it was also the richest in per capita terms. When Germany became quite dominant, it was very large economy, and at the same time, in per capita terms, very rich. US, same story, the richest economy in terms of individual welfare, in individual income, but also the largest economy. Now you will have countries such as India and the US, which are large economically speaking and are equals, so to speak, but where the living standards, of course, are still going to be much, much lower. And managing that kind of system, I think, is going to require a different politics, a different architecture, a different approach to development cooperation. I think it will be unrealistic to assume that the rich countries that are growing much more slowly, where indeed, you know, problems of unemployment and so on are quite severe, where there are all kinds of issues of shifting comparative advantage and all that, will look at, forget China and Turkey, Brazil, but even poor countries like India or Indonesia in the same way they've looked at them 10, 20 years ago. The relationship will be very different. It could create major tensions on the trade side. If climate comes in as a major issue, of course, it could create major tensions on the climate side. And on the one hand, I think one will have to remind the rich country citizens that they are still individual, I mean, on average, much, much better off than the citizens in the developing countries. At the same time, it is critical that the richer and more rapidly growing developing countries become actors in terms of helping the less developed countries and become also responsible actors in terms of the overall management of the world system. For example, when I was heading UNDP, I was very much hoping, and I got some support but very small, that, you know, countries such as Colombia, Brazil, Chile, China, India, of course, still being very poor, become real contributors to UNDP. So I think we will need to draw in the rapidly growing emerging markets much more into the development architecture in order to manage these possible tensions. The rich countries will have to get used to the fact that towards the end of the century, the old, you know, distinction between rich and developing may have largely disappeared. Maybe the 21st century will, and that's a good news, will be a century where, you know, this gap closes. But how to manage the politics of that, how to manage the relative strengths, economic strengths that are implicit in that process, I think will bring with it extremely difficult new political challenges that need to be managed. And finally, let me end with something I have not talked about, but which I think is absolutely crucial to this whole debate, but, you know, you can't talk about everything in one lecture, and that is income distribution. Because all we've talked about here was the difference between countries' component of François Bourguignon's graph. Okay? If we actually look at income distribution within countries, we see a very disturbing story emerging. Not everywhere, but in many, many places. So, combined with this convergence of average income between countries, we have, in many countries, an amazing story of divergence within the same country. And let me just talk about two of these in ending, which I think is quite worrisome: the US and China. Two examples of this divergence inside the country are actually the US and China. In the US, in the last 30 years, if you take out the entry of women into the labor force, okay, which of course increases household income, but if you adjust for that, basically real household income of the median household has not increased for 30 years. It has increased by about 10%. At the very top, the top 1% went from 8.5% of income in the late 1970s to 24% of income. And what is even more amazing to me is the 0.1% of the 1%. Okay? So 10% of the 1%, the 0.1% in the year before the crisis, 2007, made 12% of GDP. So half of the 1% income is actually earned by the 0.1%. Okay? The share of labor has declined. It's not, again, it's not the topic of today's lecture. So dramatic worsening of the income distribution in an unequalizing way in the US. The crisis has apparently reduced the top income share a little bit in 2009, but the preliminary figures for 2010 show that actually 2010 the concentration at the top will be even stronger than 2007. So tremendous divergence there. And the same, something very similar is actually happening in China. We don't have the same data, we don't have the same coverage of statistics, but the labor share has declined below 40%. Household income is extremely low, and of course some of the macroeconomic problems that are in the news are related to these distributional factors. So to end, good news on convergence between countries, and I went a little bit into details here in terms of trend. Despite the fact that we do have an integrated world economy, but if François invites me one more time, but he's really the great specialist of these income distribution matters, I think one topic that one has to look at now much more carefully in terms of the whole dynamics of the world economy is the worsening income distribution and what it means for development cooperation, because if there are super rich people in emerging market countries, the poor people and the people who are unemployed in France, in the US, or in Ireland, are going to ask, wait a minute, we have problems here, very severe problems. We can't deal with this development challenge anymore. And yet the average in these countries is still very high. But I think they have a valid point. At the same time, if the elites and the very well-off in the emerging markets don't make an effort in their own countries to correct income distribution and deal with poverty, then I think the whole fight against poverty will be undermined. Thanks a lot.